Hi, everyone. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Dr. Adam Scheller. I'm a Senior Educational Consultant with Pearson Clinical Assessment, and you are all here to hear for the next hour about the Shaywitz DyslexiaScreen. So welcome, everyone. I'm seeing some information coming through or some questions coming through about starting the webinar. So yes, we are going to get started now. I just wanted to give a couple minutes for folks that were logging in last minute. So today we are going to talk about the Shaywitz DyslexiaScreen. Again, you may have heard me discuss some topics before related to dyslexia screening. There was a webinar I did a couple weeks ago, probably now at the end of August, I'm pretty sure it was, on a model for dyslexia screening. What we heard from a lot of you was that you wanted some specific information about the screening measure specifically. So that's what I'm setting up today to do. So if you have any questions on the line with me, I have Tina Eichstadt, who is the product manager for the Shaywitz DyslexiaScreen. So if I cannot answer a question or if I can't get to your chat questions, she will be able to answer those as well. So thank you, Tina. Let's get started. We're here for the next hour. Here's our agenda. I am going to talk a little bit about dyslexia screening in general. Those of you who did participate in my previous webinar may see some information that's similar, but it's important to set up the dyslexia screen measure so that we can talk about why it's an effective use for screening for dyslexia. So I will talk a little bit about that, and then I will get into the Shaywitz DyslexiaScreen in detail. We'll look at what it is. We will look at the test, and we will also then look at the sample, reliability, and validity. And hopefully I'll be able to get to all of your questions by the end of that. We'll actually see what it looks like today. Just very quickly, for those of you who are on the line, it's pretty obvious, but I just needed to state that I am an employee of Pearson, and we do publish the Shaywitz DyslexiaScreen. Before we get started, I'm just interested to see who we have in the room with us today. We have a lot of folks from around the world in the room. So if you don't mind answering this, I'd like to get a sense of who's all here. All right, we've got a lot of folks coming in. A good percentage of school psychologists in the room. That's my background as well. My specialization is in learning and neurodevelopment, so you'll be able to hear a little bit of that as we go along today. Awesome. Well, thank you guys for taking the time to complete that. I appreciate it. So we have a good representation of different folks in the room. Okay. So let's get started in terms of the meat of the discussion today with some different points that we should consider with regard to dyslexia identification. And again, you can refer back to that screening webinar that I did at the end of August for more information about dyslexia screening in general. But I want to go over some important points so that we're on the same page. In terms of why we use a screener, it's pretty apparent for the first two bullet points that I have up there why we put into place screeners for general purposes. That third one is really what I want to focus on. The idea that if we intervene early enough, we really have a benefit for overall prognosis. So that's really the meat of why we pick screeners, the meat of why it's so important for us to pull out screeners and to focus on specific areas to look at as early as we can, getting not an identification, not a diagnosis, but an indication of weaknesses. And it's so true that there is a huge achievement gap between students with and without dyslexia, and that is evident all the way back to kindergarten and first grade. The problem is that gap exists and it persists all the way through high school. So we know specifically for dyslexia, those gaps need to be closed, and that research is quite strong, quite powerful. And those types of findings, they really do advocate for us that we have to identify weaknesses as early as possible with regard to dyslexia in order to close that gap that persists through high school. So I just wanted to really focus on that third bullet point. Of course, we know that it's helpful to intervene early, but for dyslexia, the research really does support that. With regard to the limitations, though, this is something we always have to focus on, that regardless of the fact that we are identifying weaknesses, we are identifying possible indications of an issue early on, screeners are limited. We can't provide diagnoses with screeners. We can't say, hey, if somebody gets a high score on the Shaywitz DyslexiaScreen, they have dyslexia. No. We don't do that, and we can't do that. What we're doing with the screeners, we're identifying potential areas of weakness. We're getting something that has a strong predictive ability to look at or to think about a diagnosis later on, but that's not what we're doing. We're not looking at that degree of impairment either, and we're really not looking at strengths and weaknesses. We're just looking at areas where there are potential weaknesses that show up, really where we can put into place interventions. And it's important for you to think about it this way, which is, where do dyslexia screeners lie, or where should we implement them? Are they universal, or are they tier 2? And the way to think about it, I guess, is to really just first think about what a universal screener is. And again, it is something that we put into place for everybody. It is something that we put into place for every student. It's meant for us to change or adjust instructional practices based on that data, but it doesn't have any indication of special education services. It's just a way for us to look at everybody and say, hey, how do we need to change some instructional practices in the classroom? So that's one way to look at the dyslexia screener. Do we need to put it into place for everyone to see how everybody's doing? And the other part of that is, do we put it into place at tier 2? And tier 2, of course, would be a little bit more in-depth, and it would require a little bit more previous knowledge or background knowledge, right? So we know that a child is then having difficulty with some reading areas. So what I wanted to think about was, there are some different examples here of screeners that I put up on the screen, some published by Pearson, some published by other folks. And if you look at these, they make a lot of sense when you think about tier 1 versus tier 2. You know, we see AIMSweb Plus oftentimes as more of a tier 1 universal type of screener. The Shaywitz DyslexiaScreen can be put into place on either tier 1 or tier 2. But if we look at things like the KT Brief, the KT3 and Wyatt Dyslexia Index scores, those are more suited for a tier 2 application, because they are going to require individualized assessment, right? So I just want you to be able to identify that in your mind with regard to your school system and what makes sense. So let's get into the Shaywitz DyslexiaScreen. I know this is a really hot topic, and folks are very interested in seeing what it looks like. So let's go over all the pieces of it. What is it? So you might hear me talk about the Shaywitz DyslexiaScreen. You might hear me refer to it as the SDS. That's just the abbreviation that I might use off and on. But it is a brief teacher survey, and again, we are looking at identifying at-risk students in the area of dyslexia. It is intended for use for students experiencing academic difficulties, so it can be used at tier 2, but it can also be used to screen all students, and that's why I have both universal and tier 2 capable up there, and that's why I wanted to make sure that I put it on the screen a little bit ago. It is only 5 minutes long, approximately 5 minutes. It is an online form, okay? So that means all the administration and the scoring are digital. It occurs simultaneously, right? So we don't have to actually go back and spend a lot of time on that. That's why I think the universal capability is there, because it's so quick and the scoring is done automatically that it really does not take a ton of time. And as I'll show you later on, the classification accuracy data really does indicate to us that this screener has a moderately high sensitivity and specificity. So it really is able to identify students who have a potential diagnosis or a potential disability, and it also is able to make sure that it's not pulling in too many students that do not have that disability. So that's really the important point to think about with regard to why we choose that. With regard to what it measures, it's important that it is not a comprehensive measure, of course, right? And I'm going to show you in the next slide a model for dyslexia identification. But what we see here is that the SDS does measure phonological areas, linguistic areas, and academic areas with regard to a specific student that's rated from classroom teacher observations. So it's important for us to know that this is not something that's comprehensive. Again, this is a screener. And if you look at this slide, I really like this. This is coming from a white paper that Dr. Christina Bro had authored with regard to a model for dyslexia identification. And what you see next to the yellow arrows are areas where, when I look through the dyslexia screener, these are areas that I know are going to be addressed, right? So this is the overall process, the overall areas where we want to identify potential weaknesses or potential areas of disability for students, right? So it's important that we're as comprehensive as possible, right? And more is often better when we're thinking about disability identification. But with regard to screening, it's pretty comprehensive with regard to a screener, right? So we're looking at letters and phonics and letter knowledge, word reading and decoding, written expression, an idea of whether or not reading comprehension and its relationship to listening comprehension, whether or not it's lower, some phonological processing components, orthographic processing, language impairment or poor receptive vocabulary. And this is all, if you're applying it at the Tier 2 level, it's all in relationship to a lack of response to treatment, right? So we're already getting an indication that there's a lack of response to treatment. Now, the SDS is a Qualification Level B, and we've gotten a lot of questions about that and what that means. My suggestion is, if you want a good explanation of what Qualification Level B is, go to the Pearson website, Pearson Clinical and website, and search for qualification levels, and it'll explain it to you. But essentially, I wanted to put these up here just so that you all feel comfortable about what it means with regard to the Shaywitz DyslexiaScreen. First of all, schools and school districts are able to purchase this tool just like they purchase any other tools. So school districts can do that. But if you're an individual purchaser, you must be Qualification Level B. And we'll go along why. I'll tell you a little bit more about why that is. But people who fill out the screener don't need to be Qualification Level B. In fact, we know that teachers are going to be the best responders, the best ones to actually rate and give us an indication of where the student lies, right? So the purchasers, in terms of who buys it and who analyzes it, Qualification B, but teachers are going to be the ones filling it out. Whenever you're administering a screening program, it's more than just completing a screener, right? So we know that it requires training, it requires analysis of results, it requires the dissemination of results in an appropriate manner. So that's what essentially Qualification Level B means, and that's why it is labeled as Qualification Level B. In terms of what's next, if you think about what's next after you give a screener, it does require collaborative approaches between professionals of different disciplines, and in that situation is when you will get multiple professionals across different areas collaborating. So I just wanted to make sure we reviewed that real quick, just so that folks feel comfortable about what that exactly means. I did get a question that came across: can an SLPA administer the screen? I'm guessing an SLPA is a speech language pathologist assistant. Is that correct? In that situation, yes, I believe so. Yes. Yes. Good. Okay. In terms of forms, let's think about what the forms include. So again, all the materials that you need to administer the Shaywitz are going to be available on Q Global. Q Global is an online scoring and reporting system. It's a website that you go to where all of the records and the materials are housed. And you can go to Hello Q. It's www.hello.q.com for more information on Q Global. But that's where it all is housed. There are two different forms. There's the Form 1, which is for students in kindergarten. That's ages 5-0 through 6-11, and that consists of 10 items. And there is Form 2, which is for ages 6-0 through 7-11 in grade 1, and that consists of 12 items. There are also two report options. So you have the ability to print out an individual report, and that means one teacher fills out a report, a screener on one student. You can print out a specific report for that specific student. I'll show you an example of that later on. It includes the demographic info, the risk level, and an interpretive statement. But you also have the ability to print out a group report. So if you're doing this at a more universal level or for larger groups of students, you can print out a report that includes all of the students' raw scores and risk levels by examinee ID. So you have the ability to run either one of those. And the results include a very simple classification. It's going to say either at risk for dyslexia or not at risk for dyslexia. Let me talk about a step-by-step pattern or step-by-step path for administering and reporting so that you get a sense of what the workload is going to be like. There are basically 4 steps that I have listed up here on the screen. In parentheses, I have whether or not it's for the qualified user, and what I mean by that is the person who has the administrative access to Q Global, and whether or not it's for the teacher who is actually filling out the screener. So step 1 is the qualified user should prepare the teacher for the assessment, and the way that they do that is by giving the teachers the quick guide. And the quick guide, what the quick guide does is it gives a good overview of how teachers should rate each of the areas. It gives them a good sense of what that looks like. My understanding and my thought about those is that teachers may only need to look over it a few times before they feel very confident about how to rate students. It's very intuitive, very descriptive, and it gives them a good indication of what they should be rating. So what you'll do then is provide the appropriate quick guide, either Form 1 or Form 2, to the teacher completing the screener, and just make sure that they understand the instructions, the items, and additional training as needed. So here's an example of what it looks like. You don't have these in your handouts, of course, because there's actual items in here, but I just wanted to show you the quick guide so it gives you a little idea of what we're looking at. This is for Form 1, again, kindergarten ages 5 and 6. And you can see that it gives each of the areas. So number 1 is how often does the student tell a story in logical sequence. And it's giving examples to the teacher, the behavior of sequencing events correctly when telling a story, what correct sequencing looks like, what incorrect sequencing looks like. And then you can see number 2 there, how often does the student express ideas in jumbled or incomplete sentences. And then again, we can see what the behavior is that we're looking for, and it gives a good explanation or a good description of what a jumbled or incomplete sentence is. So again, like I said earlier, this is a great resource to share with teachers and to make sure that they feel very comfortable about completing it. But as you can see here, as folks look through this once, twice, maybe 5 times, they'll feel very comfortable about how to rate them, and then probably won't need to access them much after that. Here's an example of Form 2. Again, for grade 1, we see that the first one is how often does the student have trouble expressing his or her thoughts in words. It gives you an explanation of what the behavior is, and it also gives you an explanation of what trouble expressing thoughts is. So it really does, you can look at this for another minute, it really does give you a great explanation of each of the areas, and it allows you to rate very effectively. Okay, so step 2 would be, again, from the qualified user, you'd log into Q Global and create or select an examinee or a student who's been referred for screening. At that point, then you'll assign the Shaywitz DyslexiaScreen to the examinee and then provide the teacher with access to the assessment, and there are 2 different options. The first option is on-screen administration, so if they're sitting there at the computer with you, you can actually pop up the screener and they can just take it right there in front. Or, as the administrator, you can email it to them, and that's called the remote on-screen administration. So what happens is you get a link in your email. You click on that link. It takes you to a secure testing website. You take and complete, or the teacher completes the screener. Once they're finished, the website closes down, and that information is automatically synced back up to the qualified user's Q Global account, so they get to see it immediately. The benefit to the remote on-screen is you get to send it to as many people as you need to, so that's a real positive spin on that. Step 3 is going to be the first teacher completed area. So again, steps 1 and 2 are the qualified user. Step 3 is actually completing the on-screen ratings. The teacher will follow the on-screen instructions and then enter ratings for each of the items. Again, it's going to be a 5 or 6 point Likert scale, and level 1 is going to have 10 questions. Level 2 is 12 questions, and once they finish it, it will give them an indication that they're finished. This is an example of what it looks like. Here's a screenshot from, I believe I pulled this. This is Form 1. So this is a screenshot of Form 1, what the teacher will see for the first 6 questions. So this is exactly what comes up. How often does the student tell a story in a logical sequence? Never, rarely, sometimes, often, almost always, always. Again, that's a 6 point Likert scale, If they need help, they can refer back to the quick guide and easily answer all these questions. Okay, and then step 4 would be the last step, is just to generate the reports. Again, that's the person who holds the Q Global account. After it's finished, after the screener is finished, they can generate an individual report immediately. So again, remember what I talked about, the individual report is just for that one student. They can print that off immediately. Or they have the option to generate that group report. And again, the group report, all that really needs is a bunch of students, and you can select how many ever you want, and you can aggregate all that information into one report. This is what it looks like. This is a screenshot for Q Global for any of you who are not familiar with it. So for example, I put together this student earlier this week. First name is Shaywitz, so last name is DyslexiaScreen. I know, not very creative, but this is a kindergarten student, and essentially what we did was we had a student, we had a teacher complete the on-screen administration, and you can see down here, let me pull up an arrow so you can see it. You can see down here on this line that the on-screen administration was completed and it is ready for reporting. So essentially all I would have to do at this point is generate the report, and you can see that generate report button is right here in the middle. Once I do that, you have the ability to print out these reports as either PDFs or Word documents. And what that allows you to do is allows you to pull information, if you print out the Word document, to cut and paste it into another report. So you have a lot of flexibility. It works the same as a lot of the other reports coming out of Q Global. So essentially what you'll do is, this is an example of the individual report for the student that I just talked about. Let me talk a little bit about what they look like. So if we go back, you can see that, let me just show you, let me go back to this real quick. So what I want you to do is, I want you to just think about this student. I want you to think about the ratings that I provided, and just think about the student, and think about, I know it's not all 10 questions, but just think about what you would expect from this type of a rating. So for this type of a rating, does this child tell a story in a logical sequence? Rarely. Do they express ideas in jumbled or incomplete sentences? Often. Do they have trouble expressing does he have trouble expressing his or her thoughts in words? Often. Does he have trouble identifying letters or numbers? Rarely. Does he speak in a way that is difficult to understand? Often. Does he require extra help, gestures, repetition to follow verbal directions? Sometimes. So if we look at this, there are some areas that really do indicate to us a potential area of concern, right? If I highlight those 4 right there. But if I'm looking at those areas are we know that they're directly linked to what we see in kids with dyslexia. But if we look at number 4 here, again, number 4, have trouble identifying letters or numbers. No, he doesn't really have any trouble with that. But that's not something that's unexpected, right? So kids are going to have strengths and weaknesses. And with this type of a student, how would you expect them? Would you expect them to come up as at risk or not come up as at risk? Well, here's an example of what the report looks like. So here's an example of that student's report. Their raw score was 8. The cut score for this particular student, or this particular form, is 3. So this child is at risk for dyslexia. And what it does is it gives you a nice summary statement of the results, telling you that the rating of language and academic risk factors indicates that this student is at a high enough level for us to be concerned for risk for dyslexia based on the teacher screenings, right? So the other part of it that I think is really important is the explanation of results. And what this tells you is that indicated risk for dyslexia on 8 out of 10 items, 5 items pertaining to language concerns, and 3 items containing to academic concerns. So the interesting thing about this is it also does split up the areas where the child got most areas of at risk. Now, what indicates at risk is going to be unique for each item, okay, and it's going to be dependent on the norm sample, right? So the cut score for each item in terms of what's at risk and what's not at risk isn't straight for all of them. So it's not like rarely for all of them. It's not often for all of them. It's dependent on each specific item, okay? But the cut score is here at 3, right? And we now know that this child had a lot of language issues and a lot of areas of concern for in the academic areas as well. So what I like about that is, not only is it giving us information about what, whether or not they meet the at-risk criteria, but it is also giving us some information about where we can focus some intervention for this youngster. So that this particular kid that I'm talking about has language concerns. We can really start to focus some of our intervention in that area. This is the next page of the report. It gives recommendations for next steps. It tells you a little bit about what you should potentially do. And again, this section down here at the bottom, the item responses section, is again the areas where you might want to focus some of your intervention. So we can see that the bolded items are going to be the items that meet the criteria for being at risk. So we see that items 1, these are all the items that I actually showed you. So if you look at item 1, it tells a story in a logical sequence rarely. 2 is often, 3 is often, 4, remember how I showed you 4 was not a big issue for me. It's rarely, and then the other 2 are also often and sometimes. So we see that those 5 out of 6 are considered areas of risk for dyslexia. Hopefully that comes across pretty straightforward. In terms of scoring, I do want to go over this again just to make sure we're confident about this, but the scoring is automatic in Q Global. Again, the raw score is the number of items that met the criteria for the at-risk for dyslexia classification. It's going to be compared to a normative cut score, and again, like I said, it varies by item. The total raw score for range for Form 1 is 0 to 10. So the at-risk for dyslexia requires a raw score of 4 or greater, and the total raw score range for Form 2 is 0 to 12. So the at-risk dyslexia category is a raw score of 6 or greater. In terms of interpretation of results, it is important that you go back and remember what exactly we're getting, the information we're getting. What we're getting is at risk or not at risk for dyslexia. Now, the other information is important because it does give us some indication of areas where we can focus some intervention, but it's important that we focus on what this actually means. So at risk and not at risk was really intended to be easy to interpret and easy to communicate to parents, to other teachers, and everybody else that's working with a specific student. But it's so important, this next point here, however, it's so important that you cross-validate that data with other sources of information. So never pull the dyslexia score from this dyslexia screen measure and say that the child has dyslexia. That would just be poor practice. Again, this is just a screening measure. So looking for additional measures or additional data that cross-validates it is just best practice. In terms of a student that comes up as at risk for dyslexia, what does that mean? These are some considerations that I wrote down so that you can focus on and focus your next steps, which is really just increasing the frequency and duration of interventions, trying to give them a little bit more intensity, selecting a more intensive intervention program that may meet or may address some of those concerns a little bit more in detail. Again, monitor their academic performance. It's important to continue monitoring. And if you find that it is a concern, it's persisted for some time, then refer them for a more comprehensive evaluation. Now, in terms of a student who comes up as not at risk for dyslexia, I'll show you the scores later on, the sensitivity and specificity, but it's important that we just don't leave those kids go either, right? Because even though the Shaywitz is amazing at identifying kids who have a potential dyslexia diagnosis, it is a screening measure, so it's not comprehensive. And with that, it's important to note that you should continue monitoring and supporting in a general academic setting any of those kids that come up as not at risk. Just kind of keeping the eye. And I think that that's normal practice anyway, or I know that that's normal practice anyway, and just making sure that we continue on with that. I do get the question, or we do get the question once in a while, whether or not the SDS should be given more than once per year. Okay, so what I want to do is compare and contrast that to benchmarking measures such as like AIMS-Web or AIMS-Web Plus. You know, think about what type of a measure this is again, right? This is a rating form. And what we know about rating forms like this that are screeners, that they're not as sensitive to change over time as a direct skill or direct measure of ability in a certain area, right? So my suggestion to you would be to not give this more than once a year. However, you could potentially give this once twice a year. You could give it in the beginning and at the end of the year for those kids that you had a concern about and you wanted to test whether or not they came up at risk again later on. So that would be those kids that are sort of like in that borderline area that you may want to think about looking at again. But again, just remember that this is a screening measure. It's not as accurate as something like, let me go back real quick to show you some additional. Let me talk about some of the additional ones again. Let me find the slide. I apologize. I'm trying to scroll through as quickly as I can. I got it. So if we're looking at this slide here, where we have the Shaywitz up at the top, the other three are going to be tests that are a little bit more sensitive to change over time. So if you wanted to give something like the Ames Web Plus multiple times a year, that would be effective. The Shaywitz is probably less of a tool that I would use multiple times a year, but it's possible. It is something that you could give once or twice a year if necessary. The KT, the KT3 brief, the KT3, and the Wyatt also all have gross scale measures, gross scale values, so they are also very sensitive to change over time. All right, let me find my way back to where I left off, which was right here. Nope, next slide. Sorry, folks, I'm trying to get there. All right, so that's really a way for us to answer that last question there. Hopefully that gives you a good indication. Not that you can't give it, but it's not a measure that I would tend to choose for benchmarking throughout the year. Okay, so let's look at, we have a couple more minutes here. We are going to go through the sample, the reliability and validity. Now this is really important information because we want to make sure that even though we are casting a net, right, we want to make sure that the net that we're casting with the Shaywitz is going to be effective for the students that we have in our school or the students that we're going to be addressing with this specific measure. So in terms of the sample, the initial sample came from Dr. Shaywitz's longitudinal study, the Connecticut longitudinal study that she started back in 1983. So there were 414 Connecticut school children that were entering public kindergarten at that time, as well as their parents, their teachers. They all provided data for the initial set of norms that Shaywitz DyslexiaScreen had. In addition, though, what's so important is this next one that's bolded. In addition, we have an additional sample of 115 children between the ages of 5 and 7 that participated in a national clinical validity study that we conducted here at Pearson to validate that data. So essentially what we did was we took the data from the initial study, ran a clinical validation study to make sure that it all made sense and to make sure that the measure held up psychometric scrutiny. So all of the students, it's important to note that all of the students that participated in both samples spoke English as their primary language. So I have a lot of questions that oftentimes come through as, should I use this screening measure for children with that are learning English as a second language? Now, that question I'm going to leave up to your interpretation. My suggestion to you is to think about what the sample is. So the sample is used on students who spoke English as their primary language. So essentially, if you're pulling out the Shaywitz tool for use with ESL population, you need to know its limitation. You always have to figure that first before you look at the data and look at whether or not that information can drive or can give you more data to drive your decision. So you have to be very, very careful when doing that, okay? So I just wanted to make sure I pointed that out. So here is the information from the validity study. We can see right next to each other, here's the validity sample next to the Connecticut sample. And we see that it matches fairly consistently to the U.S. Census. So this is the 2014 U.S. Census. We see that it has a pretty good split of demographics across the board. In terms of how, we do also get this question quite often too, how did the initial longitudinal study identify students with dyslexia? Well, there were two different ways. First, the every student was given word recognition, decoding, and reading comprehension tests every year through grade 12. So they were giving the reading cluster tests from the WJ educational battery. Additionally, every other year through grade 12, they were given the full-scale battery from the Wechsler Intelligence Scale. So they were continued to be assessed with that over time. So the two different ways that they were identified is using the WJ and the WISC data at 2nd and 4th grade. Students with dyslexia were identified either with discrepancy criterion or low achievement criterion, or both. So the discrepancy criterion was using a 1.5 standard deviation discrepancy, predicted discrepancy, and the low achievement criterion was a reading cluster score below 90, which is considered the 25th percentile. So those criteria did identify the children as poor readers, with little evidence of differences between the subgroups formed with one criterion versus another. And you can see that that was from data going back to 92 and then again replicated in 2003. So students who met that criteria for dyslexia in grade 2 and or 4 were placed in the dyslexia group, and all other students in the sample were placed in what they called the typical group. In terms of the evidence of reliability, again, remember, I'm reporting all this data based on the national clinical study. So I'll show you all this information. It's not going back to the 83 study, the longitudinal